Dr. Dave joins us today to ask questions from his point of view.
On multiple points of view. Good. Well, I would like to ask you to follow up on a conversation we had earlier regarding Luzatto, Rabbi Luzatto, and his relationship to Jewish mysticism in particular. Please.
Moshe Chayim Luzatto lived in Milan, Italy, in the early part of the 1700s. His relationship to normative Jewish culture was strained.
What was normative Jewish culture and why was it strained?
Well, I'd like to suggest at that point that there was no orthodoxy because there was no reform. The reform was on the cusp of occurring, but had not yet. So in general, just as a brief aside, in the world, to have an orthodoxy, you must first have a reform. So in the conventional narrative conveyance, you'd say there was 3,800 years of Torah observance, and it was a standard, and some individuals kept more and some individuals kept less, but the standard was a standard. And some point toward the later 1700s, middle 1700s, there was the reform in Germany mostly, and then it spread. And eventually, maybe 100 years later, some people wanted to take back some ground and they established the conservative. But these are all departures from the long accepted standard. So I'm just calling that the Jewish culture of the day in 1710, 1720. He only lived for 33 years. The conventional view is that the stress on his mind and body was so tremendous that he expired prematurely. And the reason was his views were so controversial to the mainstream line of perspective that they just wanted him out of the world. And they burned tons of his work. He was prolific already. It's noted to have been prolific somewhere between 12 and 14 on deep Kabbalistic topics. It may have even begun earlier in childhood. When someone has that kind of genius, they're probably putting out content as a child. Maybe it's overlooked. In a culture or in a community like that, it wouldn't have been overlooked. But in his teen years, when he started writing deeply, and into his 20s, certainly in his 20s, he began to take a lot of flack because his perspectives, while lining up congruently with an absolute value, were just outrageous and disturbing to that generation's leadership and the masses. They could have burned him, they would have.
So I think they call that antinomial, going against the established norm.
Maybe some people do.
Yeah.
Technically, antinomian is a specific terminology applied to Christians from the first century who wanted to assert that they were no longer under the bondage of the law. So that was a certain term that had already been used in a different subcontext in Hellenized culture, antinomian, against the nomenclature of the law of its day. Not really useful to the that broad an application, but I hear where you're going with the concept.
Good. Well, how was how did Luzatto, or why did Luzatto, why was he controversial?
Well, a beginning approach to him is that he liked to be involved with the secular world. There are certain genuine Kabbalists these days who are quite into examining pop music, modern cinema, art, because embedded within there is an intelligence that's speaking through the vessel that's producing these generative forms of expression, however the medium may be. So a thing that he was really into was plays. He was really into the common plays, even secular plays that were being put on in Milan, Italy, where he lived, and producing plays. And what he was seeing is a much deeper aspect of reality contained within the allegory of a common story. This was out of sync with things that the establishment felt were befitting such an individual. They're unbecoming, they're beneath the aloof ears, if you will, of the establishment. That was a thing. And then there was mostly his view on secular science, that secular science examined through an intelligent lens of Torah culture, or thereby Kabbalistic culture, or culture that looks at things through a internally corrected geometry calibrated to a coherence in natural law and the law of things, which is the law of correspondence, the law of congruence, that that science could be useful. So he wrote books on that and said it was incumbent upon every individual in the Torah community to look into the natural sciences and put it on a platform where it was elevated and audited and then examined and restored to the place, or integrated to the place it should be.
So those are, thank you, those are some of his, some of the reasons involving his secular views. But he also had religious views which were controversial.
He definitely did. Thank you, Dr. Dave. And that's really just picking at, yes, the surface of the antagonism toward him. To get to the heart of it, there is a sentiment that runs so counter to the conventional mainstream Torah view that they felt he had no place in that community or in the world. And it takes some really looking into him to discern this, but to speak it out plainly, he was asserting that the Torah giver, Moshe, actually was invested in the Sitra Achra that is later described allegedly through him and certain of his writings. So in traditional Jewish and Torah culture,
The Sitra Achra, some people may not be familiar with that term.
of course not, I'll get there, but thank you.
Okay.
In traditional Jewish and Torah culture, and just in the literalism of the Old Testament's first 5 books, Moses is hands down, don't believe you disagree or argue, the protagonist. However, Rav Moshe Chayim Luzatto, this rabbi from Milan, Italy, in 1720, began to allege that perhaps a different rendering was required. And this got in direct conflict with major authorities, say the Rambam. One of his distillments of the principles of Judaism was that Moshe could never be wrong. And there would never be a prophet like Moshe. It's impossible to unseat him. But the RACMCHAL was willing to ask some very deep Kabbalistic questions. Let's cover that. So Sitra is a side. This is, and Achra is other. And these are Aramaic words. They're not Hebrew. They're Aramaic. It's the conveyance of the majority of Kabbalistic writings is in Aramaic, and there's a reason they like that vocabulary. It's got a little bit of a slantier edge. And it's a Hebraized Aramaic that was being used pretty universally in the first century. It's adopted from Standard Aramaic. It was a first century Aramaic used in Judea. And it's also the language that the Talmud, which is composed of the Gemara and the Mishnah, is written in, as well as small parts of the book of Daniel, and then in Nehemiah and Ezra, there's a sampling of this kind of Aramaic. So these sources suggest that, contrary to the mainstream belief, even up until this day, Moshe was not so much of a protagonist, more of a acquiescing hero who began in filth in the mystery and magic schools of a sinister side of the occult under Pharaoh. And there's actually not a lot of disagreement about that. But the notion in the mainstream Torah community is that he cleaned up, came out of that. It's brought down from several different angles, including Torah sources and some non-Torah sources, that he was a king for a minute. He fled Egypt and he went to Midian, and he was a king. Some deep sonophonic sounds that play through a frequency bands, a little advanced, but I'll just stick a thumbtack here. Midianite Moshe, which becomes a code called Midnight Mouse, and deals with some substrata text in the Torah, because everything seems to happen b'chatzot halayla, at midnight. So even a piyut, a famous religious song poem at midnight that's done at Pesach, Passover. Coming back to the center points here, though. So it's a suggestion that Moses never fully cleaned up, more that he was the man at the place at the time to be the man. And he was interacting with a force, clearly, that gave him deep access to a kind of intelligence and information that was profound, beyond any singular human's mental capacity. Definitely had a higher power presenting the cohesiveness of the material. Its networked nuances, dimensionally too vast for even the best and the brightest. And that's only been borne out beyond reductive opinions, say, of even 60 years ago, as computing came online and became more and more upgraded, enhanced, advanced, and took a look at this text and went, whoa, what? There is so much embedded that it takes supercomputers to look at the kind of comprehensive integrity of the document and the hypertext linked communication that's going on between the lines. So clearly something beyond human reason, an individual human reason, because that actually support that these forces are the combined components of many human beings, but certainly not a single human being, or not even a small council could have put this together, as some academics want to allege. That was tenable only up until supercomputers evaluated this document and said, no way. That's just not conceivable. Unless you want to then come around on that and say, well, maybe it was, but the divine intelligence was genuinely working through the human vesselship. That is kind of the religious opinion, and that would work too, and ultimately is more so what we're really saying and supporting that. The question, though, is sometimes individuals take for granted that just because it's a higher intelligence, that it's benevolent, or like that's the only thing out there, or just a more generic view of evil. It's being controlled by a higher power for a purpose, or is it allowed to roam and have certain range? But the idea of unbridled evil just existing with high power doesn't exist generally too much in common consciousness. Now, there are certainly individuals who have investigated and even made their devotion to the fact that it does exist in some very high effect. Well, it does exist, so the suggestion is that there is, that got really a little esoteric there. So let me see if I can just ground it back down to some known quantities: Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's the assertion by Rabbi Moshe Chayim Luzatto of Milan that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were on a different thing than Moses later. That they're relating to an essence referred to in the Hebrew of the Torah as Ahiyah, Asher Ahiyah, the am that is am, or the is that is ising. A state of being that's open-ended, it's just existing. Now, Moses seems inept and clueless to the nature of this amness in the famous incident at the burning bush. He comes to the burning bush, and the part that's being overlooked by most individuals who encounter the tale is that he's extremely unfamiliar with the phrase Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. It has to be said, blasted at him, because he's out of touch with it. He comes up to the bush and he says, "What's your name?" That may sound benign, like, I guess, you have some kind of supernatural conversation with light and some sort of fire emanating from a bush. Maybe you want to have a name. Doesn't sound unreasonable on its face. For centuries, if not thousands of years, people haven't taken that as. But if you look at what a name is, you give a child a name, you say, so-and-so, Jimmy, Chaim, come here, Chin, here, it's a handle, hey, don't run off, Roberto, don't run off the edge of the cliff. Get over here. It's to handle, to get that specific individual to attend and come. Hey, so if this is the ultimate expression, this bush incident, of the divine nature itself, it's like, what are you doing asking for a name? Are you attempting to be superior to the emanating presence? Because that's how the emanating presence related to Moshe's question. Like, you want to what? Take your shoes off and get over here. And now eventually it's sort of akin more to a dream. The way in a dream, your mind is ambiently aware of notions. They're not all spelled out, spoken out, or set out for you. It's just some things because you're in your mind, and your mind relating to itself in the dream. So the emanation from this force is expressing within Moshe, saying, your forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, referred to me. It's to say as a qualifier, it's not a name. They referred to me as Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. And again, it's the fact that this needs to be broadcast into Moses because he's unfamiliar with the sense of am that is am. And what does he do? We don't go around seeing through the rest of the Torah as transmitted by Moses and ultimately the last bit by Joshua, any real constant relation to some entity named Ehyeh. That's not on the tip of everybody's tongue. That's being introduced as some interesting Hebrew vocabulary. If people are aware of the Torah, okay, they've heard it, but in relation to this, in relation to that moment at the bush, and Kabbalah talks about the attributes, but what's consistently through the Torah, Moshe comes away from this experience and he invents a handle. So these are some of the things that Moshe Chayim Luzatto is bringing out, this rabbi from Milan. And the establishment is like, what? He's saying Moshe Mekabel Tuma. Moshe brought out a corruption. He's because he comes away and he names this force hitherto referred to by the word El or Elohim, which was a standard fare in Mesopotamia in general in Phoenicia to say El. And they weren't referring, like many generically believe, to God. No, it was specifically Saturn. In that region, it was well known that El, the worship or the devotion direction to El was Saturn specifically. It's interesting. This is going to become intrinsically relative, that in Roman cultures, Saturn is the entity. We're not necessarily talking about a planet. We're talking about a series of attributes to a living entity that holds a certain frequency bandwidth, and it's out there, Saturn. And so the Romans had devotion to Saturn. Now we get a lot of cultures relating to this parameter 7 days, which wasn't always consistent in Rome, but 7 days. It's definitely consistent from coming out of Israel and eventually becomes our secular norm. 7 days, color spectrum divided into 7, musical spectrum divided into 7. Now you can do a lot of different divisions, but this is what we did because kings are wearing crowns, women are wearing rings, earrings, marriage rings. This is all satanic for the rings of Saturn because Saturn, the god, got involved with the ceremony. Now, a lot of traditional Jews and Torah people don't want to hear that, but there's a heavy, even Babylonian influence that comes out of the months. Talmud accepts it and it says we adopt it for a variety of reasons. It's deeper. So in Greek, Saturn is Chronos, time, father time. This is a matter of time. It is some sort of entity, nefarious, sinister, or at least out for its own agenda that is encapsulating or capturing or kidnapping everybody into time. So that was known in Mesopotamia that El or Elohim was not generically God. It was specifically the cosmic force Saturn. Comes along Moses, being schooled in all these occult and esoteric traditions, probably a little more sinister and filth from the Pharaoh's palace. He comes away from his Ehyeh, the Am that is Am experience, and he develops a new name that permeates the entire Torah, Yud He Vav He, or Yud He Waw He, commonly misspoken as Yahweh. That's not just a error or a wrong thing to enunciate that name. It's just a clerical error and doesn't technically exist except in certain Christian cultures. The reason is that is not a word. So Paleo Hebrew has 2-letter roots. Basic ancient Hebrew has 3 or 4-letter roots, usually 3. That's not a word. That never was a word. It's not a word. What it is an acronym. The Yud is Yihya, the Hey and the Vav are Hova, and the last Hey is Haya. So it's the tense of future, the tense of present, and the tense of past. So Moses comes away from his experience with an unlimited presence, an Am that is Am, and then he puts a getter, a limiter down to future, present, past. Now, down here in the slave mind, you've got theologians going, what a wonderful gift that God has given us time to reflect upon and review. Or it's a prison. You're in a prison of time. So we expand, we take a look at the Vedantic culture, and they've got a concept they've given us called Maya. Back in Kabbalah culture, we'd call this the Dimion, or the it's kind of a holograph by today's parlance. We're talking about being in a matrix or a construct of some sort that is permeable, editable by something sort of unseen. Stuff, files migrate in, files migrate out. We're in some sort of a matrix. This is going to be a useful thing later because matrix or matrice is maternal. We say, oh, we're in the material world. Yeah, matter or mater, mother, mom. This is going to be later, but just putting it thumbtacks here. This is the material or maternal world that we're existing in. So we say in the Vedantic culture that there is this Maya. You know, it's a veil. There's a veil. There's scales upon the eyes. As you come into so-called enlightenment, then these scales begin to slowly drop away. They say you're cleaning the sanskaras. You're cleaning away impressions. So you have an impression or a static neurological frame, a rigid way of processing, a rigid way of viewing. You come to a place, you come constantly, and you don't really adjust your literal visual calibration. It's just like Pavlovian antennae. As you stop and you ground and you take a look around a little better, then you can come out of this static impression that you had of a place. And bringing it back to this concept of Maya, so we're in a delusion, meaning we're in reality, but we don't fully see what the game board of reality is or is doing. And now that's been ongoing as a consequence of deeper levels of our creation and what brought us to this current state of experience. And settled on top of that comes along an actual illusion. Now, most people confuse the first for that, but time is the actual illusion. So we've got this Yahweh thing, this prison of time, which is just like throwing dust in the eyes of ourself, which has already been confounded by existing in substance or substrate or the medium and membrane of reality, the world, the material world that we're walking around in, experiencing our body in, is already confusing enough. It's already a delusion. We're deluded about what it is. And then something comes along like, hey, I mean, you look pretty confused. I'll just throw some dust in your eye and put an actual illusion of time. So Moshe Chayim Luzatto was bringing out this, it seems like the patriarchs, the Abba, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they were on some different track than what Moses brought in later. Moshe brought in a Tuma, and that the Torah world should have never had the Torah. It was sort of a concession, like, well, you guys are so unwilling to take account for yourself, to be responsible for your souls, to be proactive, do what Abraham did, to get inside your source space and figure it out. Here's a bunch of parameters and stuff. But really, would have been better that you just tuned in to the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, and took a download. And now it seems like in what we're entering into, even according to a very heavy Torah authority, the Vilna Gaon said even then, this is just a generation after of Moshe Chayim Luzatto, toward the end of the 79ers, said we are entering into the Ichvasei de Meshifta, the heels of the Messiah. We're coming toward, again, in Vedantic culture, say we're getting to the end of the Kali Yuga, this harshness, this abrasive age. But it's going to get really, there's just things that are going to happen here at the end of the age that are just obscene. They're just impossible, nearly impossible. We feel as though we couldn't get through it. That you know, if we do it correctly, there'll be some relief and some grace. And there'll be grace for those in between who keep putting themselves in the mind space manually. It's a manual effort to be. So that is one of the big, huge things that Rabbi Moshe Chayim Luzatto expressed, this questioning where we could truncate down to the nature of God in this more advanced way of putting it. And that was just not going to fly with the establishment. And saying that there was an issue with this transmission from Moses, and that the fathers Abraham, Isaac were much pure, and Jacob were much pure. So that is a massive point of contention. That is just not acceptable in mainstream Jewish conceptualization. But he wrote these eloquent books, and he did not write in Aramaic like most Kabbalists. He wrote everything in plain Hebrew. And well, maybe not plain. It's kind of a stylized, customized Hebrew that you get into, that he uses words in a really enlivening way. And you get into his sing-song rhythmic pentameter of what he's doing. He starts with there are three well-known books in what we call the Litvish Ashkenazi yeshiva world. There's some real heavy terminology for people who are outside that world, but it is a niche place that they look at. It's Mesilas Yesharim, Derech Hashem, and Das Tavunos. So in some simple English, that's the path of the just, the path of the straight path, the way of divine consciousness, and the inner knowing of the inner heart. And it's someplace between absolute knowing and intuition, das tavunos, bina and da. So these are three books, and in his conceptualization, each of them went in. So it's sort of like nesting dolls, but in reverse. So you start with this outer layer of Mesilas Yesharim, and then it's like you go inside that to Derech Hashem, and you go inside that to Das Tavunos. And I also wrote these interesting books that explain what he did on a daily basis. Derech HaSeichel, he wrote 2 books on logic and the path of how to actually approach reason in learning and debate mechanisms. That was Derek Tavunos and Sefer Hegion on logic and inquiry. And then there are 10 main books of Kabbalah that they didn't burn, and somehow they got transmitted down. And those are what are just sort of left over there by the mainstream. Even those who intersect those 3 main books, they don't want to know about those because it says some weird stuff that seems to contradict everything that the foundations of their religiosity is built on. And the encapsulation of that is much of what I just said. So.
Well, thank you. That's pretty clear. So he was advocating this earlier relationship that the patriarchs had, and not the yeshiva-based.
Well, it's long before the yeshiva, but the Moses tabernacle desert walk. It's basically like saying that a satanic force was leading them through the desert to become their master and use them for its agenda in the world. And that's super unpopular and hard for most to hear, but if the shoe fits, and that to come to genuine realized consciousness is a much harder thing to do, and it's outside the boundaries. So in our synthesized view of taking in everybody's information, stepping outside just the confines of the Torah world, which say is this lovely quote attributed to the original Dalai Lama. Now that's Tibetan Buddhism, so they're integrating many Nepalese shamanic attributes as well as what became more Buddhist mainland. That's what they call it, in Theravada, these more rudimentary Buddhist simplicity coming out from the Vedantic culture of India. But in Tibetan Buddhism, they began over the decades to integrate Nepalese shamanic notions, primarily the bodhisattva, the idea of an individual who takes on the karma, the energy, the suffering quality of an individual, and then works that out inside their more advanced system, and somehow that assists by some API style devicing, some networking that assists the individual they received it from. So it's sort of like, if you're the advanced individual, you sort of will just walk by or engage in some capacity, maybe it's even online. The field taps into the field. And the idea of bodily proximity makes it simpler. You kind of come by and sort of take a composite sample of that individual with you. you sort of become them for a minute, and you're like, well, this is dysfunctional. And as the advanced individual, quickly work through that dysfunction, that's a sort of karmic tikkun, a karmic repair. You're adjusting that like a mechanic, like a computer tech would come up to somebody and be like, this is ridiculous. And they're fixing your parameters, and that translates back some way like mycelium or a computer network within it, some good, well managed API. It's upgrading that individual, updating their system. That's the idea of the bodhisattva, or bearing even for a generation the aggregate of the generation. And you're not. You're on
It
mute.
says I think we're out of time for this recording, Z.
Did it stop?
No, not yet, but it
Yeah.
says less than a minute.
Really? Yeah, I was keeping it. Yeah. So
Okay.
probably just stop it.